Welcome to this webinar on disseminating research. This is one of the largest sections of the research lifecycle, and it's an area where the librarian skill set can be used very effectively to support the research community. We'll be looking at everything the researcher needs to know about getting published and sharing their work, from publication through to promotion. It goes without saying that there is a lot of work that goes on before a researcher gets to the publication stage, and it's worth thinking about some of the background before we move on to the actual how of publishing. We'll start with a simple question. Why do researchers actually publish? It sounds like a really obvious question with really obvious answers, but it's worth thinking about to put everything else we'll cover into context. Fairly obviously, researchers will publish because they have to progress in their careers. Publication is seen by many as the gold standard of sharing in academia, and professional researchers need to have publications on their CV. Part of having publications on their record is that it enhances the reputation of the researcher. If these publications make a good impact, it can have a long-term effect on the academic career as researchers get more and more recognised for their work. Publishing increases the visibility of work and helps to get ideas out into both the academic and the public arena. Researchers will have worked hard on their project, and wanting other people to see it is only natural. Publishing provides a record of the work that's been done in some tangible form. Research itself is about furthering knowledge, and publication is one way of sharing the work that's been done and contributing to this advancement. Of course, researchers might also just have an interest in a topic and want to contribute to the continued discussions. Although researchers may have to and want to publish during their academic career, there are some barriers that they may have to overcome. These barriers are obviously not unique to the research community, and many listeners will probably recognise at least some of the areas on this list. A lack of confidence is something that almost all writers suffer with at one stage, no matter how much writing they may have done in the past. Writing for publication is a very specific skill, and it can be daunting if you've only written for academic purposes previously. The only way to get over this, unfortunately, is to start writing and gain some actual experience. It's one of those things that will come in time. We all see researchers as being confident writers, but I think that a lack of confidence is still a big issue for many, especially at the start of their career. Rejection rates for all types of publication are high. For example, the well-known journal Nature has only an 8% acceptance rate, which means that it rejects many more manuscripts than it ends up publishing. When a researcher has put a lot of time and effort into something, such as producing a manuscript, it can be very disheartening to be rejected. Unfortunately, this is again something that researchers will have to learn to live with, although it might be an idea to start by submitting to a journal which is less selective. The most obvious resource that's lacking is time, but unfortunately no one can schedule an extra hour in the day, so it's a question of making time. A little and often approach works for some people by giving them a regular time to commit to writing. Researchers might also feel a lack of support, but hopefully this is an area that librarians can help with. Again, much like the lack of confidence issue, some researchers aren't sure that they have the skills to write for publication. I know that a lot of libraries offer training and support in this area, and again it's something that comes with practice. Everyone has something to say, and often people underestimate what others will find interesting. Not knowing where to publish or not knowing what to say can be quite a large barrier for many researchers, but it may just be a case of looking for the right format and publisher, which is what we'll move on to talk about. Although researchers can use Word, Pages, or just plain pen and paper, there are a lot of new tools which they can use to help them in preparing their work for publication. Researchers often work in groups to produce their research output, and collaborative writing tools really help this process. Google Docs and Google Drive are often used by researchers either through private or institutional accounts. Just remember that when you're using these to be aware of any security concerns. Overleaf is a site aimed at writing scientific documents and produces fully typeset output that researchers can use, which would save some formatting time later on. Authorea is an online tool which has a lot of extra features such as built-in templates from certain journals and conferences, and integrates well with other platforms which let the researcher embed data and code directly into the document. There are also similar tools which can be used to create and monitor citations to make sure that everything is in the same style for submission. EndNote and Zotero are reference management software that I'm sure many people will have come across. These help researchers to keep track of references and format them when they need to. In Mendeley, researchers can create profiles and bibliographies. This has evolved from being a site which just organises references to a much larger tool, but it does what researchers need it to do. Papers is designed for Apple users and does come with a charge, but it's worth mentioning as it's growing in popularity with researchers. Now we'll move on to talking about getting published once researchers have overcome all these issues. One of the first major decisions a researcher will have to make when publishing is which format do they want to aim for. Do they want to write a journal article, or are they aiming for a longer publication such as a book? The type of format that they choose will often depend on the type of research they're doing or their particular discipline. For many researchers, the ideal publication will be something scholarly, such as a book or a peer-reviewed article, as they need this for their CV, but there are other options they may wish to consider. If they want to make an impact outside academia, then they might need to look at other less formal publication options, or creating several publications for different audience levels. So, for example, they might produce a research article for a scholarly journal, a conference presentation, and something for a popular magazine such as The New Scientist. For many at an early stage of their career, their PhD is the most significant piece of work they've produced, so it makes sense to turn this into a publication. What researchers need to remember is that it's not as simple as reprinting sections of the thesis or even the whole thing. There's work to do first. Researchers can start by making a list of all the possible publications they could get out of the thesis. The findings may be one journal article, the method another, and they could also look at publishing a literature review separately. They might want to do a couple of conference presentations on the same theme, and then maybe write an article for a professional magazine. Once they have this list, they should look at everything they want to produce and prioritise in terms of what they can realistically achieve. Do they need a certain publication on their CV? Do they have time to write a whole book, for example? Is it more important to get something in print quickly? They can then use this to build a publication strategy that will suit their needs. The important thing is to remember to balance the publications they wish to aim for and what they can realistically achieve. So we can see that there are a lot of factors to consider when it comes to choosing a format. Over the next couple of slides, we have a checklist that you can use to help researchers make a decision. It's not exhaustive, but it provides a good place to start. What are they trying to achieve with this publication? How big of an audience are they trying to reach? Are they looking for a high-profile addition to their CV, or do they just need something quick so as to have it in print? This should be the starting point for making a decision. Will the format achieve what they want it to? Who is the audience? Are they aiming for an audience of their peers, or do they want to reach a wider market? What level are their audience at? Will they understand scholarly language, or does something need to be written for the popular market? This is where thinking about making an impact outside of academia becomes a key consideration. The thoughts of peers is something that affects researchers at different stages of their careers differently. Within each discipline, there will be certain formats that are considered better than others. This might be particularly important to an early career researcher looking to make a positive impression. Think about how long the publication is. Does the researcher have enough material to produce a long book, or is their work better suited to a chapter in a collated work? Consider how quickly they wish to get published. Do they need a publication on their CV quickly, or can they afford to wait a little while? Different publication formats have different publication times, so if the researcher needs something in print quickly, they might need to choose a format with a faster turnaround time. What do they realistically have time to produce? This is connected to how fast they want to get published, and researchers need to look at what they realistically have time to work on. Do they have the time to devote to a long publication, or do they only have time to produce a short article? It's best to be realistic about what can be produced with the time and resources available. They also need to think about the publication schedule of the publisher. Is there a specific call for publications that needs to be met? And does this need to be factored into the researcher's schedule? As well as the cost in time, it's worth considering any financial implications from publication. Will an output need to be made available open access? If so, who will pay for this? Are there any other costs that need to be considered? Finally, they need to consider if they're ready to be rejected. It might sound silly, but it's an important factor to think about. Some publications have a much higher reject rate than others, and this can have an impact on the individual researcher. If a publication has a very high rejection rate, it might be worth trying to pursue a different format. Again, this list is not exhaustive, but it's a useful place to start when thinking about choosing a format for publication. Although it's not really a competition, the most common decision about publication formats comes between writing for a book or writing for a journal. Sometimes there isn't a choice, as the discipline will favour one over the other, but it's worth spending a bit of time looking at it. Books have a strong narrative argument that's connected to the wider literature and are often long and in-depth. Of course, there are different types of book and different ways researchers can contribute to them. They can write the whole thing, focus on one chapter, be an editor, or contribute to a general textbook. Many publishers are now wising up to the fact that researchers might not be able to produce an 800-page research text and offering the chance to publish shorter books, which much more closely mirror the PhD. Palgrave and Cambridge University Press both offer these shorter titles, which can provide a good introduction to monograph publishing, as they have very fast turnaround times. To write a book, the researcher will probably need to submit a proposal, so we've put together some guidelines. Start with a clear and descriptive title. Don't try to be too clever, just be sensible and try to get across what the book is about. It can and probably will be changed later. Set out the scope and aims of the book as well as why it's an original contribution. Publishers aren't likely to go for something that covers the same old tired argument. Include an outline of the target audience that the book is aiming for. Who's going to buy this book? Make sure that the audience matches up with the publisher's target market. If you can include a detailed table of contents with a brief summary of what each chapter is about, then that will be a bonus. If you have any sample chapters, you can include them, but remember that less is more. Finally, include a short author biography emphasizing who you are and why you are qualified to talk about this topic. Of course, it goes without saying that it's always a good plan to check the individual publisher requirements for a proposal. These are just some general guidelines. In contrast to books, journals have a much tighter focus, dealing with one or two ideas and tend to be based on new evidence. Again, there are different formats of a journal article which vary by discipline and publisher. Areas with fast-moving research tend to prefer journals as a format, as it gets the work out into the public arena faster. Articles should have contextualized references to current and previous research. Essentially, this is a literature review, although it varies by discipline as to how in-depth this needs to be. They should include an explanation of any theory used in the researcher's own words, and again, this does vary by discipline. Articles should be research-informed and evidence-based in their content, and are usually self-contained pieces of work which look at the results of an investigation or a new theory. Finally, articles should focus around an arguable research question. They can't just be waffle on a topic. The article has to be arguing a position on a topic or question. Finally, it's worth mentioning some other formats that researchers may want to use to publish. These are mainly outside of traditional academic publishing, but can really help to make that elusive impact. Presenting work at conferences can lead to publication through the conference proceedings, either as a book or a journal, which is a factor to bear in mind. Magazine articles have the potential to be accessible to a much wider audience than a traditional book or academic journal. Researchers should try to identify publications in the popular press which would be suitable for their work, such as The Economist. Most of these magazines also have some type of digital platform which will help to spread the research further. Researchers should be encouraged to blog about the results of their research. This again opens things up to a wider audience and increases the chance that it could get picked up by a wider publication. Researchers shouldn't be afraid to blog their research as they go along, as this not only timestamps the research, but opens it up to debate and further investigation. Finally, news stories are seen as the gold standard of impact. If your research makes the news, then it can reach a really wide audience who might not otherwise have gone looking for it. As always, make sure that the researcher chooses the most appropriate format for the particular piece of work they're working on. It can be tempting to turn everything into either a book or a journal article, but is the research really suited to that format? Once the researcher has chosen a format, they need to think about approaching a publisher of that format. This might be as a response to a call for papers, or it might be approaching the publisher blind. As with choosing a format, there are several factors to consider when trying to choose which publisher to approach. Does the publisher publish work in that particular research area? Look at other titles or back issues to see what types of research have been covered, so that you don't waste your or the publisher's time. What type of format does the publisher publish in? Does this matter to you? For some researchers, the publication needs to be in hard copy, but for others, an electronic-only copy will do. Think about how long the average time frame is from submission to publication and whether this matters to the researcher. As we mentioned earlier, some monograph publishers are recognizing the fact that long publication times can be off-putting and are introducing shorter formats, which encourage faster publication. If a researcher wants to make the work available open access, this will obviously incur a cost for both articles and books. Who is going to pay for this? Has this actually been factored into any grant application that's been made? Each discipline has its own favoured publishers, so researchers might want to look at what's considered the gold standard by their peers. They could think about titles that they themselves read and factor this into their decision. Finally, the metrics and the prestige of a publisher within a discipline can have a huge impact on whether researchers will publish with them, and in some areas this is in fact the biggest factor in their decision. Once something has been written and a publisher has been chosen, how does the researcher lessen the chance of getting rejected? Unfortunately, there are no surefire methods of helping people to secure a yes, but we do have some tips. Always check the specific author guidelines of the publisher. It sounds like common sense, but you'd be surprised at how many people don't actually do it. The guidelines should be easy to find on the website, and using them will help to make a good impression on the publisher and increase the likelihood that the submission will at least be considered. Triple check spelling, grammar and punctuation, as mistakes can land a good piece of work on the instant reject pile. Read the piece through, but don't think about the research hidden behind it. How does it work as a standalone piece of writing? Does it read well? Being well written will help to sell it to publishers. Look at the structure and make sure that any arguments are convincing and flow well. Does it convince the reader of the importance of that particular piece of research? Think about language and if it's appropriate to the audience you're aiming for. If the work is too technical, it might not be suited to a popular audience, and an audience of peers may expect more detail. One way to get a feel for these things is to read a few articles or chapters from the publisher you're aiming for to better understand the writing style that they're looking for. In today's environment of online open access publishing models, one of the biggest pitfalls to avoid is the predatory publisher. Predatory publishers are hard to define. What may be considered predatory action to some can actually be a legitimate big business practice for others. Most people have heard of predatory publishers thanks to a scholarly communication librarian in the US named Jeffrey Beall, who maintained a list of supposed predatory publishers until it disappeared in January 2017. These publishers often solicit content via email, which can be attractive to an inexperienced researcher who are flattered to be asked to publish something. The problem is that these publishers exploit the open access model by charging authors for services they don't provide. With open access, the fee that's paid to the publisher covers things such as editing and review, but predatory publishers often share the work as is, even if it's wrong or completely made up. Essentially, they're a form of vanity press. They charge authors to make work available. But are they really a problem? Many people argue that they're a growing problem in the publishing industry. They can limit publication with reputable publishers. So in order to publish, the researcher will likely have to sign away the copyright to that piece of work, which means that they're then unable to publish it anywhere else. Even if they discover that the publisher is not who they thought, there's not much they can do about it, as most of these firms will then charge a lot of money to release the work back. In essence, it's a wasted publication. In extreme circumstances, it can have a negative impact on the researcher's career. The publication is often looked down on by promotion or tenure committees, and sometimes counts against people for not showing better judgment. At best, it's an embarrassment on a CV. As these outputs aren't rigorously tested, it means mistakes and fake research can slip through to publication. Even if the individual paper is good, it can end up sitting next to poor research and getting tainted by association, so bad research practices are perpetuated. However, there are also some who don't think that these publishers present much of a problem and that they do actually fulfill a need. There's an argument to be made that academics at a large institution in the West have the resources to support traditional legitimate publication, but others aren't so lucky, especially in developing countries. For a predatory publisher or a so-called predatory publisher, they do actually provide a needed service. It's worth noting that differing reward systems in different places equal different behaviours. For some researchers, it's important to have a publication on their CV, and going through the peer review and rejection process can take some time. Paying a fee to publish might seem like a good idea under these circumstances, and the outcome is broadly the same. With these things in mind, you could say that these publishers are serving a need and have a viable business model. There's a need and they're fulfilling it, so as long as people understand the risks, then what's the problem? All this is of course open to debate. We're going to quickly talk about peer review. Whatever the discipline, it's something researchers will come across if they're publishing in scholarly literature. It's often quite a mysterious process if you've never been through it before, but librarians can help to explain the basics to researchers who may have questions. Peer review is essentially a quality control system for published research, which looks at the individual publication, its suitability to be published in a particular title, and the strength of the underlying research. Experts are invited to comment on the research output and assess it according to some sort of rubric. They often make suggestions for improvements and then recommend whether something is published or not. Peer review articles have been considered the gold standard in academic publishing for a long time. Anyone can publish something, but if it's been approved by peers, it's seen as high quality. However, in recent years, questions have been raised about the traditional peer review model used in scholarly publishing. It's been accused of being unreliable and inconsistent in that it relies heavily on individual human judgment. It's not consistently applied across all publications and not even consistently applied within some publications themselves. Decisions and comments can be inconsistent amongst different reviewers. Going through formal peer review means that the time from submission to publication increases. Increased costs in both time for reviewers and money for publishers, as well as having time to coordinate the review. There's the potential to subvert the process. Reviewers and editors have a lot of power, and reviewers are typically anonymous and can conceal any conflict of interest, and in extreme cases they can actually block competing research from being published. Finally, there's a lack of incentive for reviewers, which means it can be hard to get people to actually review content. The pool of experts in a particular field may be very small, and is it right that such small numbers should be controlling which research gets published in that field? Also, peer reviews receive little or no compensation, and it can be argued that institutions shouldn't be paying subscription charges when their academics are doing a lot of unpaid editing work on the side. To counteract this, and as part of the general move towards open research, there have been calls for open peer review. This aims to make the peer review process more transparent, so reviewers sign their names to their comments instead of being anonymous. This helps to make the process of peer review more accessible and allows review authors to receive credit for their work. There are a number of platforms available for researchers to do this, such as Publons, PubPeer, and journalreview.org. The process of disseminating research no longer finishes upon publication. Researchers now have to consider promoting their research and sharing their data. Sharing research used to just mean publishing, but now we have to factor in rules around open access and funder mandates. Some funders will specify where and how researchers should share their work, whilst others leave the choice up to the individual, but the accepted practice is to share it via an online repository. There are some basic things to consider when it comes to sharing both the published output and the underpinning data via a repository. Is the research required to share it somewhere specific, so has the funder specified a particular repository which must be used? This is often the simplest way, as the decision has already been made for the researcher. Consider which is the most suitable repository for the output. Is it best in a subject repository, or is it more suited to a general platform? Does the researcher want the work to be linked to their institution, or would they prefer a more general audience? Finally, think about which channels their peers use. Is there an accepted repository within that discipline where most people share their work? It's worth mentioning at this point that social networking sites such as academia.edu and ResearchGate are not open access repositories. These are commercial platforms which don't guarantee access or preservation. They don't meet open access requirements, and researchers need to be wary of copyright issues as well. Having said that, we all know that researchers will use them. The best way to share research on these sites is to create a record of your research, but link to a legitimate version of it online, usually the one found in the open access repository. Having an online presence of some description is vital for the 21st century researcher. People will search for them online, and if the researcher is smart, they can control the narrative that appears. There are too many possible sites to go into detail, but I do have a couple of pieces of crucial advice. If as librarians you encourage researchers to have only one online presence, make it an ORCID or an Open Researcher and Contributor ID. This is a unique identifier for researchers, kind of like a DIY for a person. It will move with the researcher and is being used for many other online systems for identification purposes. It helps with disambiguation and brings together all the research outputs written by a particular person and provides a record of the work. Remember to be cautious with academic social networks. These sites exist to put researchers in touch with each other, but remember that they are commercial companies. They're not just there to provide access, but to make money. It's also crucial to be aware of copyright restrictions when sharing on these sites. When evaluating any potential online platform, especially social media, think about a few basic issues. Consider the sustainability and longevity of the platform that you're using. It's often not guaranteed. Some are owned by commercial publishers, which will have an impact on their sustainability. Using these sites can easily create duplicates of outputs, and this may impact metrics, which can again impact a researcher's career further down the line. As we've mentioned, a lot of the content on these sites, either intentionally or unintentionally, infringes copyright. Make sure you advise researchers on what they can and can't share. Finally, registering for these sites can sometimes result in a lot of spam or extra emails, which may be a concern for some researchers. It's important to think about how librarians can get involved in promoting the work of their department. To do this, they obviously need to find out what is happening and which research is being produced. There are several ways of doing this. You can set up an alert service across different platforms to alert you to new content, either from your department or on a particular topic. You can check university websites or publications for the same type of information. Conferences are a good way to assess the current research landscape. Try and look out for papers at the major conferences in your discipline to keep up to date with the new research areas. Are there any local internal systems used for collecting researcher data that you could possibly mine for content? Altmetric.com is a service which is used to score different metrics for social media and other sites, but you can actually search this for local papers getting attention that you might not otherwise have come across. And again, it can be as simple as attending departmental meetings or events and having coffee. Just keep your ear to the ground and find out what's happening. I'll leave you with some top tips about disseminating research. Remember that one piece of research can result in multiple publications. Although the ultimate outcome might be a scholarly publication, it's important not to neglect the wider audience. Think about repackaging research for a less academic audience if suitable. Consider the best format and publisher for the output that's being produced, and consider each piece of research on its individual merits. Think about the best way to share this particular work. Librarians are in an ideal position to offer this advice, as they will get to know the formats and publishers available in their area. Be cautious of offers to publish that seem too good to be true, because they probably are. Try to educate researchers about predatory publishers and conferences so that they can recognise the signs. Finally, think about a promotional strategy to make a real impact. Consider the best way to make an impact with, again, this particular piece of research. Is it something that could be newsworthy? Could you at least share it with the wider university? Planning a strategy early on will help to make a bigger impact later. Thanks for listening.